Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's presentation on infectious disinformation inoculation, tools and strategies to stay safe during a raging infodemic. My name is Jim Pavlik, and I'm the Senior Program and Policy Analyst at the Behavioral Health and Wellness Program at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. Today's presentation is different than our previous clinical edge endeavors, even ones on the same topic of vaccine hesitancy. Some of the things I'll say today may feel a bit controversial, or they may be challenging. They may feel judgmental. I understand that, and I will try to cage my comments in the most value-neutral way that I can. If, however, I do scrape against a sensitive area for you, I want you to keep in mind that while I am the author of these words, I'm also the lead bad example that I'm using, and I'm the main audience that I intended to help. The opinions and thoughts presented here are my own and not the university's or BHWP's, and I have no other conflicts of interest to declare. It really was only as I began the process of gathering resources, which I'll present in the final section, that I realized that I may not be alone in feeling the threat presented by a quasi-coordinated and deliberate campaign to undermine America's public health through infecting millions of unwitting Americans with disinformation designed to be shared with friends, family, coworkers, and vulnerable strangers. There are two assumptions that must be believed to understand why this presentation exists, and I'm going to present them on this slide in a preamble to the presentation, because since this presentation was actually written for me, I didn't actually include them in the main content. These are my assumptions. The first is that changing people's minds is possible, and I know this because I've changed my mind on all sorts of things, and I trust that each of you has experienced your own mind having been changed. To create this presentation, I looked into the literature on how to engage with and correct disinformation and misinformation, a literature, I should add, I was already familiar with because of my career as a public health communications specialist. And then I tried to put some of this advice in practice via online engagement. What will follow on the upcoming slides does not represent the totality of everything I found, although I will provide a lot of resources so that you can jump over the wall of my curation. These are the elements of what I found either newly useful or worth reminding myself of. I will get to a point in the upcoming sections on inoculating messages intended to inoculate others against the weaponized information they may run across. And what I realized is that anybody engaging in this work requires inoculation. So now I'm getting to the other fundamental assumption that you need to accept. You're not special. You are not immune from disinformation. Look at all the doctors, nurses, and public health officials, many with long, prestigious careers that are out there right now spreading disinformation. Now, we can, of course, question their motives, but we also know that they speak our language. They've been to medical school. They know the limits of that education. They know the language of epidemiology. They know how to cage arguments so that superficially they may be believed. They know how to sow doubt. And frankly, that's all that's needed, just a little seed of doubt. Look at the Great Barrington Declaration, which I will not be getting into, but many of you probably already know about it. Medical professionals and public health officials are specific targets of campaigns like that. Which is to say, for the past several months, we've been asking our medical professionals, especially our primary care docs, to engage with patients and on social media to correct misinformation. And not without good reason. One of the really clear messages that I've heard from focus groups that we've been able to conduct here at BHWP is that people trust their doctors, period, full stop. No matter what else you may have heard about what people believe and why they're not getting the vaccine or why they may be holding off for a little bit, the one thing that I've heard consistently is that if their doctor took the time to reassure them of the shot's safety, they would be reassured. So the first thing you need to know is that there is a lot of misinformation out there, but there's also a lot of disinformation out there. The difference between the two is intention. Misinformation are just things that people get wrong. We will talk about the data void as a risk factor for an infodemic later. Disinformation, on the other hand, is wrong information that is deliberately spread to achieve some purpose. In this case, we have a few agents deliberately sowing disinformation. Some of that seems to be for personal fame and fortune. Some of it is taking place at the level of international politics. Pictured here on the left is the cover of a report done by the nonprofit group, the Center for Countering Digital Hate, where they were able to determine that about 65% of all vaccine-related disinformation circulating on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram was attributable specifically to 12 individuals that they dub the Disinformation Dozen. And on the right, a spattering of headlines reporting that a lot of the vaccine disinformation in America is generated specifically by foreign powers, and in particular, Russia and China. So, with all that in mind, here's what I want to do from here. I'm going to define and teach what an infodemic is, including where the term originates. From there, I'll present a hypothesis of why this infodemic is worse than the infodemics that preceded our current one, a hypothesis that I think serves as a rationale for a specific approach to engagement. Although I have to admit that on a large scale, this is an untested hypothesis, although it does have an evidence base in clinical or near clinical applications. From that general background, we'll move into some skills, skills that you can add or practice to protect yourself from the dangerous pull of disinformation, including what I think is the absolutely best skill from my own personal experience. In parts 3 and 4, I'll move into those things to look out for in the words of others so that we can engage with specific characteristics of the mis and disinformation that they have already heard and inoculate them against future mis and disinformation. Part 3 here is best characterized as identifying species of mis and disinformation, whereas part 4 are the tactics and techniques that you can use to tailor your corrections in the right way, including an important tactic for communicating to populations rather than individuals. And then finally, in part 5, I will quickly introduce you to some resources that you can use personally or that you can share with individuals you're working with, whether those are patients, the public, friends, or even family. So what is an infodemic, and how bad is our current one? I think it's an interesting bit of trivia that the term infodemic originated with the original SARS outbreaks in the early 2000s. Although I'll add that I don't think the central event that serves as the inception of an infodemic has to be a viral epidemic. At its heart, an infodemic relies on modern information technologies. This means to me that no infodemic could have preceded the printing press, that being the first mass media technology. But of course, it took a long time for the printing press to truly hit a mass media tipping point. And I would suggest that the late 19th and early 20th centuries as the point in time where the printing press really hits that level of an industrial scale. And that roughly corresponds to the creation of the telegraph, the railroad, and continent-wide postal delivery. And all of those things help to connect people. The second thing that's required is a mixture of facts and rumor tied to some event. And I would add to that the facts that are circulated with the rumors are deliberate. The insertion of facts mixed with lies serves to add a veneer of authority and legitimacy to the speaker, so as to transfer a veneer of seeming truth to the rumors. The rumors, however, are designed to exacerbate the existential discomfort associated with facing the unknown, the data void. I'll be referring frequently to this concept of the data void, so it's worth sticking with me here for just a little bit. The data void I like to think of in terms of a Nietzschean abyss. The human mind is a storyteller, and it understands the world through stories, and it will create a story as soon as there are two bits of data that can reasonably be connected through a story. Scientists are trained to refrain from creating a story. Their job, and of course I'm being overly simplistic here, is to try and find the real story. They train their brain to withhold making a story right away. Then, as the data compels them to make a story, they still don't create a story. Instead, they ask themselves, is this the story? And they design tests to see if the story they're seeing is the real one. By contrast, those who seek to exercise power over others don't bother asking questions of the data they're given. They can simply create whatever story will be the most persuasive to get people to do what they want. And many of these stories will include a mention of the data void to uncertainty as a way of psychologically compelling their targets to leap toward the nearest promise of certainty for comfort. And this presents us with a genuine power imbalance. Scientists, public health leaders, and other professionals who genuinely want to help are constrained by the facts. Therefore, we insist that people sit with uncertainty, staring into that abyss until the facts are known. Meanwhile, fearmongers can spread whatever information they want, regardless of the truth. They can fill the data void with certainty. In fact, as you're probably all aware by now, they can fill the data void with thousands and thousands of factoids, and they can provide instructions on how to assemble these factoids together in whichever shape provides the most utility to the assembler. It is in this regard that the internet is the best reservoir of viral disinformation, because it can hold all the disinformation as discrete units, as well as provide the environment in which these discrete units encounter one another, are combined, disaggregated, and recombined into their most viral form. There is no selective pressure for disinformation to become less viral, which leads us to the notion that the internet itself is the reason that this current infodemic is the worst one. However, as we can see, the term itself originated in 2003, at least 6 years after the commercial internet as we currently understand it, and probably closer to 12 or 15 years, if you can think back to Prodigy, AOL Online, and the original bulletin board internet. Another idea that has been proffered to explain how bad this infodemic has gotten is the death of expertise. And I'll return to a second reason why I think the so-called death of expertise is and has been exaggerated. One that I hope adds a more empathetic reading to those we hope to engage with and reassure. But for now, I just want to look at the data to suggest that maybe the death of expertise has been exaggerated. So here we see a few tables charting individuals' confidence in various kinds of experts since 2016. And what we can see is that depending on which kind of expert you're talking about, military, scientists, medical scientists, school teachers, etc., these numbers are essentially flat. And for the most part, if there is truly a trend, that trend is upward. And trust me, as a person who engages online a lot and is eyewitness to and victim of the disrespect paid to experts, I know this data doesn't correspond with our experience. But that's precisely why we have data. If the world were comprehensible without data, we wouldn't need to collect it. It's hard to reconcile the data with our personal experience. So allow me a brief conjecture that those who disrespect expertise just tend to be the loudest about it. They both speak out more frequently, and when they do so more intensely. Or if you engage online a lot, you might already be familiar with the phrase, Twitter is not real life. And just to clarify, these numbers stop in 2019, before the pandemic. I'm talking about the death of expertise here as an aggravating factor for starting the infodemic. I'm not commenting on what has happened to the reputation of experts since March 2020. The other thing to note on this slide is that while confidence in elected officials is up from 2016, it has always been low. I would suspect it was lower in 2016 and 2018, precisely because those are election years where negative ads were running at high degree. And you can see in these charts that confidence in elected officials goes up 12 points just from the first half of 2018 to the second half. In any case, confidence in elected officials is low, and we can probably assume that to the extent there is, quote, confidence in elected officials, individuals tend to trust those on their side of the political spectrum while distrusting those from the other. But in fact, this assumption has some evidence to support it. Partisanship is growing. And I know that these slides are a bit hard to see. I think all of this information is pretty telling, but there are two pieces of data on this slide I want to draw your attention to specifically. And the first is the rightmost bars in the middle of the slide. 27% of Democrats think that Republicans are a threat to the nation's well-being, and 36% of Republicans think that of Democrats. The second is the entire set of graphs on the left. And you can see that partisanship in 1994 was recognizable, and you can see that it has grown by 2004. Still, 1994 looks far more like 2004 than 2004 looks like 2014. As a political science student, which I was a long time ago, I've been following this growing partisanship for quite some time. And I can't say that I was really taken aback. I can say that I was really taken aback when partisanship began taking hold of the political discourse in 2016. I honestly wondered if people thought it was worse in 2016 than it was in 2008 or 2004. I don't have 2016 or 2020 charts, but I think it's probably the case that it is. Indeed, worse than it was even in 2014. Which is all to say that there used to be a much broader political consensus on what the problems of the nation were, and in a sort of general sense, what the available set of solutions were. This political dynamic, though, where Republicans and Democrats simply do not perceive the same world, has been simply laid onto the pandemic. We take our lead from our political leaders and perceive those that take their lead from other political leaders as a threat to our nation's well-being. I mean, look at the prevalence of vaccinations as they stood in late June of 2021 and compared to the presidential vote share. Is this data subject to the ecological fallacy? Absolutely. But the correspondence here, in my opinion, is probably not just coincidental. But again, we don't have to rely on my opinion in order to know if it is in fact the case that political ideology is driving a lot of the vaccine uptake decisions that people are making. We simply have to ask people what their vaccination status is or their vaccination willingness and also their political leanings. And when we do that, voila. I want to sit with this point for a bit because it is the most salient point for figuring out why persuading someone to change their minds on the issue of vaccines is so hard. And it's this: for many folks, the vaccines are not the point. The vaccines are a symbolic central figure in an ongoing and growing cultural divide. In the vaccine hesitancy space, public health, as of late, has been focusing their attention on what are being called the vaccine hesitant but not hostile. I haven't seen a good definition of who the vaccine hostile is. I don't want to propose an official definition right now. I think we know in a general way who's meant here, but I want to try to draw a tighter circle around who I am and who I am not talking about. There are roughly 150 million unvaccinated Americans at the time that I gathered this data. A third of them are children below the age of 12 who are not allowed to get the vaccine, and I'm not talking about them. Of the 100 million adults, there are slight discrepancies between racial and ethnic groups, and much of that difference has been talked about in terms of medical distrust. But I think that analysis exaggerates this particular problem as it pertains to the COVID vaccines. And I would like to take a moment to talk about why I think that's the case. I think that's the case because that's what the data suggests to me. And to be clear, before going on, I want to be sure that everybody hears what I'm saying. I'm not saying there isn't medical distrust. We've heard it from folks directly. We at BHWP have heard it from folks directly. But if we're wrong about how important it is as a driving factor for vaccine uptake, then what the constant refrain of saying medical distrust over and over and over again does, what that does is it blames unvaccinated communities for making the decision to not get vaccinated instead of putting the blame where it probably belongs, which is on a public health and medical system that simply doesn't provide access to these to these vaccines on an equitable basis. If you look at the data, it just simply does not tell a story dominated by racial and ethnic medical distrust. First, let us consider that older Americans are disproportionately white and that there are a lot of systemic reasons why that's the case. But with COVID, age has also been an important variable determining outcomes, and similarly, age has been an important variable determining government outreach and access. Individuals over the age of 65 were prioritized to get the vaccine. They were heavily marketed to, and of course, acceptance of the vaccine in that population is very high. In fact, in a recent Kaiser Family Foundation poll, only 7% of respondents over the age of 65 said they would definitely not get the vaccine. And that number may seem too high, and it is, but it was also the second lowest group of the ones you see here. As of July 21st, 85% of individuals over the age of 65 had already been vaccinated. And we need to remember that that demographic is disproportionately white. Now, so what is the uptake between white and Black? Well, 70% of white Americans are vaccinated and 65% of Black Americans. Again, these figures are from July 21st. So there is a gap here, and some of that gap is probably accounted for by the disproportionate whiteness of older Americans. But what about the remainder of the gap? Is that an access problem, or is that an interest or distrust issue? The percent of whites that said they would only get the vaccine if required was 2%. It was also 2% of the Blacks that were surveyed. And if we look at the percent of each that responded definitely not, it was 15% of whites and 16% of Blacks. So a single point gap here, and potentially not even real, as this likely falls within the margin of error. The 5-point gap in uptake is real, but individual resistance doesn't seem to be playing as large a role as it seems to be given in the popular media. Do we need specific outreach and different persuasive tactics to reach this population? Yes, of course we do. But when I'm talking about vaccine hesitant individuals, this is not who I mean. So who am I talking about? I'm talking about Republicans and conservatives. In the same study, the number of Republicans responding definitely not, I would definitely not get the vaccine, was 20% compared to 5% of Democrats. In the only if required bucket, there are 5% of Republicans compared to only 2% of Democrats. 15% of Republicans said they wanted to wait and see compared to only 4% of Democrats. And this reluctance is reflected in the overall uptake rates. The group of Americans with the smallest uptake rate by far were Republicans. Only 54% of respondents in the Kaiser survey compared to 86% of Democrats. On a personal note, I wouldn't have chosen Republicans and Democrats as the way to categorize these individuals. I would have gone with something more like a conservative leaning, that kind of thing, liberals, liberal leaning. So the group or groups we're talking about are mostly young conservative leaning males, and especially those living in rural areas. So this leads us to a hypothesis for how we need to be engaging. Like it or not, vaccine uptake is downstream from political ideology. And that means it's connected to a thing, political ideology, that has growing salience as an identity marker. People are not simply vaccinated or unvaccinated. Exercising the choice to get vaccinated or not is to stake their vaccine status as a part of who they are. So at this point, we can return to the point I alluded to earlier, the vaccine hesitant and the vaccine hostile. The vaccine hostile are not just telling you what they're going to do, they're telling you who they are. The vaccine hesitant have not made their vaccination status a part of their identity yet. With the vaccine hostile, we need to think of ways to decouple vaccine status from political identity. With the vaccine hesitant, we need to talk to them and about them in ways so as not to encourage them to link vaccination status to their identities, political or otherwise. Tribalism, including ideological tribalism, is a type of bandwagoning, a thing that we all do to find safety and security in the face of danger. If individuals do not fear attacks, they won't feel as pressing a need for safety. And I think most of you know this, and in your day-to-day practice, I suspect that with most of the vaccine hesitant, even vaccine hostile individuals you talk to, you're able to do so respectfully. It's mostly on the internet, when the veil of anonymity is thickest and people can be the rudest, that we're most likely to experience the most vitriolic attacks, and where we're most tempted to respond to those attacks with anger. Again, I'm speaking generally, so please remind yourself at this point that I am talking about me and I am talking to me. If this applies to you too, I hope that what I'm saying helps. If it doesn't apply to you, I hope that something I say later can be more useful. So every infodemic is going to share some risk factors and characteristics with the others. Each is also going to have its own unique set of characteristics. In the case of COVID, there have been rumors about the disease itself, and there have been an entirely different set of rumors about the vaccine. And I'm not going to go into each and every one of the various conspiracy theories that are tied to the vaccine or the virus, nor could I. They arrive and grow faster than any one individual can track, I think. Nor do I think you necessarily need to familiarize yourself with each and every one of them. As I mentioned earlier, since they're not at all constrained by the facts, the creators of disinformation can say whatever they want. All you need to do is familiarize yourself with the smaller set of facts that outline the truth and be confident that you know how those facts are known. Which is to say, it's actually much, much easier to memorize what's true than to try to keep up with the infinitude of lies. And that's going to lead us to part 2. How do we protect ourselves from this fire hydrant of lies that are assaulting our cognitive defenses? I'll begin where a lot of presentations like this begin, and that's with cognitive biases and logical fallacies, with a focus on the former, since the latter are deployed to exploit them. Now, here's the thing. There are so many cognitive biases and rhetorical strategies to exploit them that you can literally take a class on just those things. I can talk for 17 straight hours on this topic. I could assign logical fallacy homework. As much as I love knowing about these things and having been trained to go hunt for them, I find that without spending the time to explore and respond to them, knowing about them, like knowing their names, can actually just be problematic. There is a tendency to believe that if you know about, let's say, confirmation bias, and if you can find it in others, that somehow protects you from it yourself. In the last couple of years, accusing people of having fallen prey to the Dunning-Kruger effect is notable in this regard. And for those of you who don't know, the Dunning-Kruger effect describes an association between the degree of confidence one has in their abilities in a specific domain and their actual knowledge or training in that domain. Funnily enough, although this concept requires a pretty advanced understanding of a specific branch of psychology, I don't think anyone I've ever seen use it as an insult online has a BA in psychology, let alone an advanced degree, meaning that there's a very good possibility that the person who uses Dunning-Kruger as an insult is maybe a tad overconfidence in their ability to assess whether the Dunning-Kruger effect is in fact actually being observed. But this innate talismanic effect is maybe less important than the basic tactical errors it encourages us to make in our arguments. And I'll return to this tactical error when I return to logical fallacies in the next section. What I want to do now is provide three main strategies to help protect us from sliding down the rabbit hole of social media, a place where, and I am not making this up, people argue that there is no such thing as an infectious disease, that all cases of polio came from the polio vaccine itself, and where governments around the world planned the pandemic specifically because they didn't like Trump as president. Down is up and up is down. Now, the first strategy is basic statistical literacy. Again, I don't have the time to do this right now. Even a short course in statistical literacy is a few hours long. However, what I did do is put on this slide the questions that I always explicitly ask when I'm reading a piece of journalism reporting on any scientific paper. Although the age adjustment question is specific to studies where people are the subject of the study and where age is or might reasonably be expected to be an important covariate, which is absolutely the case with SARS-2 and COVID, you need to be able to answer all these questions at least to have any confidence that whatever conclusion is being argued for in the piece has any justifiability. If any of these questions are not answered in the article, these are the things I look for first when I go and access the actual paper. And there are there other questions that need to be answered? Yes, absolutely. For example, you may have heard recently that in Israel, 50% of Delta variant COVID cases were among the vaccinated, and that this was proof the vaccine didn't work. But of course, at the time, about 80% of Israelis were vaccinated. So you can imagine if there were, let's say, 100 Israelis, and if there were 10 total infections, 5 of them occurred among the 80 vaccinated folks, and 5 of them occurred among the 20 non-vaccinated folks, unvaccinated folks. What this means is, although 50% of infections are among the vaccinated, it is also the case that that equals a 5 over 80 or 6% infection rate among the vaccinated compared to a 5 over 20 or 25% infection rate among the unvaccinated. At the time, those headlines were, they were powering major disinformation campaigns. So while they were doing that, while they were powering these disinformation campaigns, the vaccines were actually mathematically proving remarkably effective in the face of a variant that wasn't part of the initial trials. So is knowing about the so-called base rate fallacy important for statistical literacy? Sure, but the base rate fallacy is downstream the questions on this slide. We are all easily persuaded by a rhetorically well-constructed argument, and I don't mean this in any way to say that journalists are deliberately trying to persuade or lead us. Journalism is an art, and part of that art is writing well. If something is well written, we're just more likely to take it at face value. When we read a newspaper or a magazine article, we do so already equipped with a lot of knowledge about stuff. And the knowledge we bring to bear on an article, combined with what we read in an article, leads our storytelling brain to create new facts that bridge what the journalist wrote to what we already know. This is an assumptive logic that we do innately. Turning this function off is a type of cognitive restraint that we can practice and deploy. But more importantly, if it is to be used, it must be deployed. That is, activated and used consciously. Thinking well, including thinking statistically, does not simply happen. You have to do it intentionally. Which leads me here. Thinking about the fundamental statistical concepts is a really important specific strategy. And I'll talk about another one in just a second, lateral reading. Bridging them is simply this: slow down. When you're reading or hearing new information, take a breath and simply slow down. Then do this. Ask yourself to make explicit what you already know or believe about the topic at hand. List it. Ideally, write it down as clearly and succinctly as you can. But otherwise, just list them in your head. Also, try to articulate as best you can the question, the specific question that is trying to be answered in this paper, podcast, this video, whatever. Answer that question and then ask yourself, given what I already know or believe already, how confident am I that I already know the answer to this question? At that point, ask yourself what you would need to change your mind. What would you specifically need? What new evidence would you need? How impressive or concrete would that evidence have to be? And then Identify specifically the claims the author is making. An argument is a set of claims that lead to a specific conclusion. All the claims should be necessary to make the final conclusion, and there should be no claims lacking. We call these the standards of necessity and sufficiency. Next, ask yourself to imagine what the best data to answer the question at hand would be. What would you want in an ideal world? What would you want in the world we actually live in? And then look to see what the researchers actually observed. Was this a large randomized sample, or is there the potential for selection or survivor biases? Was it a proxy measure rather than the actual thing itself? How might this difference impact what they concluded? Finally, remind yourself that data, analysis, and replication have to matter more than personalities. At the same time, we do need to consider what an individual may be influenced to believe given their role. As they say in political science, where you stand depends on where you sit. We should read science skeptically. That said, we can't slow down to a stop. We can't read literally every single article on COVID or the vaccines with the monastic attention of a dissertation writer. Knowing the potential bias of an author can give us clues where they may be a little less careful in their designs or their collection or their analysis. Now, we can hope that multiple authors and peer review will drive these potential missteps down, but we can't assume they'll be driven to zero. So the next and final skill to talk about before we talk about inoculating others is lateral reading. And this has been given quite a bit of buzz over the last few years, especially since March, when we became suddenly aware of how woefully poor our critical reading skills were. As professionals in an information-dense space, there's a good chance that even if you have never heard the words lateral reading together, you probably already do it instinctively. The basic idea is that in the old days, pre-lateral reading, critical reading skills were taught by saying things like, check the source. Is this a verified news source or a peer-reviewed article? Then you would check the author. Then you would read the article. Then you would engage in some critical reading skills, checking for logical fallacies, that kind of thing. In lateral reading, you sort of scan down the article in question. And at each stage where the article mentions something that can and should be independently verifiable, you leave the article and go and independently verify it. But that's assuming that you even scan down the article. Many of the articles we're tempted to read nowadays are given to us by either a social media algorithm like Facebook or Twitter's, or they're shared to us by a friend. So there's a good chance that by the time normals like you and I receive that invitation to read, others have already read it and responded to it. What does the meta conversation around that article look like? Has its main thesis already been debunked? Has the author been exposed as a fraud? I do recommend a course in lateral reading, even if you essentially already do this. Tightening up this particular skill set is never going to be not useful. But in any case, the bottom line is the bottom line on this slide. The truth is in the network. As much as the internet is the reservoir of viral information, it also has within it all the good info we need to combat that disinformation. It's just sometimes a little harder to get to. So now I'm going to talk about our tactics and techniques for inoculating others. I do want to reiterate that debunking does work. I've already mentioned this, but it's worth mentioning again. There's a lot of new and great research on persuasion and argumentation. A lot of that work is being done in the political science realm. And here I'm thinking of Brendan Nyan. I'm also thinking in the psychology world of Jonathan Haidt's work, which I think can be reasonably applied to this discussion. I think you can add Daniel Kahneman here and a bunch of others. I think a quick read of a lot of this literature would lead you to believe that debunking is a fruitless endeavor, but I don't think that's right. I do think that on net, it forces us to conclude that debunking how we natively do it doesn't work. And I think you have to accept that that education alone is insufficient for debunking and that people won't logic themselves out of any position that they didn't logic themselves into. This is an important part, so I'm going to pause and I'm going to try to say that all a different way. We all hold a lot of positions, and we believe that we hold those positions because we read a bunch of facts, and then after deep consideration of those facts led us to the conclusions that we hold. We also believe that people who do not hold the same beliefs that we do hold erroneous beliefs, either because they do not know the same things that we do, or because they did not deeply consider them. And this leads us to a theory of persuasion that if we could simply educate people about the facts, they would be naturally led to where we are on those topics. The fact is that we do not hold most of the beliefs that we hold because we have deeply considered all the available facts. And if it is the case that we ourselves do not hold the positions we hold by virtue of the inevitability of the facts, then it cannot be the case that the facts alone are enough to persuade people to also hold those positions. Nevertheless, debunking can and does work, and it begins with an inoculating message. The first thing we need to do is make people aware that others are trying to deceive them. And you'll note that I began this presentation with a clear articulation that you, mental health, medical, and public health professionals hearing my voice, are being targeted for deception. And then the message provides defenses for that deception. Part 2 of this presentation began that part of the message. Parts 3, 4, and 5 will continue it. We need to recognize the main weapons of deception. Part 2, I stole the ones listed here from one of the resources listed in the final section, and I'll provide a link to that guide shortly. But rather than going through each of them here, I'm simply going to defer you to that guide. I will reiterate 2 techniques that I've already elevated, the first and the last ones on this slide. I have already mentioned the Great Barrington Declaration. That is signed by several supposed experts, including one Dr. Fake Person. And I'm not making that up. Now, this person is an obvious fake, but other kinds of fake experts are actually just genuine practitioners of the field who've been discredited, sometimes even barred from practice. This genuine act of having been discredited or shunned from a major field is often perceived as a virtue, though, by the people we're trying to persuade. So you have to be careful bringing that up, right? You can't just say, well, Dr. So-and-so was disbarred, and therefore we shouldn't trust what he has to say, because the person you're talking to may actually perceive that they were disbarred for speaking the truth, right? I think, or barred from practice, not disbarred. I think the most common form of fake experts, however, are people who simply just aren't really experts in the specific field at all, because lay people don't really know who qualifies as an expert. For example, to what extent should we trust a hematologist's opinions about COVID or SARS-2, right? SARS-2 impacts the circulatory system, might use cells within the circulatory system as entry points. It causes heart attack and strokes. For a while, it was proposed that it was infecting or otherwise directly impacting blood cells. And should we value the hematologist's opinion over the immunologist's? Or what about the epidemiologists? All the epidemiologists that I've been talking to or following on social media are simultaneously quick to opine on things pandemic, but also quick to defer to both research and clinical immunologists when their opinions are known and more directly applicable. But how is a layperson to know when the immunologist's expertise ends and the epidemiologist's begins? When is the thoracic surgeon's opinion more important than internalists or cardiologists? And I'm not saying that these lines aren't knowable. I'm saying that those of us in or near these fields have a much better sense of when we and our colleagues are within the scope of their expertise and when they're nearing the periphery. But when 2 cosmetic surgeons got celebrated early in this pandemic for a long video where they misused statistics, I think we should have all understood at that point that a great deal of people either do not know that there are different kinds of doctors with different kinds of expertise, or they simply didn't care that was the case. The second technique I want to elevate are the logical fallacies, and I said I would return to this concept. I want to say a few things about logical fallacies. And the first one is this. First, let's talk about what a logical fallacy is. And to do that, I want to restate what an argument is. An argument is a collection of necessary and sufficient claims that support a single conclusion. A valid argument is one where all the claims presented are needed to make a conclusion and no claims that are needed to make that conclusion are left out. An argument is valid if the conclusion logically follows from the claims. Whether a conclusion is true or not depends on whether each claim is true. If the argument is valid and all the claims are true, then the conclusion must also be true. Truth and validity are separate characteristics being applied to different parts of the argument. Okay, so logical fallacies, and there are a lot of them, generally describe mistakes in the way 2 or more claims are connected, or the way a set of claims connects to the conclusion, or they describe mistakes in assigning a truth value to a claim by an appeal to something that is not necessarily true. So why am I bringing this up? Well, not understanding or not appreciating the distinction between truth and validity leads us to the fallacy, the belief that if a logical fallacy is identified, then the conclusion must be false. And that's not true. The argument may be invalid, but that's a different feature than the truth value of the conclusion itself. Another problem with knowing too much about logical fallacies is that people have a tendency to assume that the person who made the fallacy has done so deliberately and is therefore a malicious individual, or that they're too stupid to notice that they've committed an error. And I think this leads us to discussions that are needlessly combative. A third problem is one I already brought up. This idea that if you simply know the names of a lot of fallacies, and if you've been trained to spot them, then you won't make those mistakes in your own arguments, and you'll be able to spot them inherently in the arguments of others. In my experience, neither of these things is true. Perhaps most importantly, there is a tendency to believe that if you can name the logical fallacy a person is using, then you will suddenly see how their argument that they will see how their argument does not work. And I'm speaking to myself again when I tell you that is definitely not true. I have very dear friends who I argue with on the internet all the time. We disagree a lot. And I know that they aren't writing their arguments to disingenuously persuade me, right? Or their other readers. But they commit a lot of logical fallacies. And I can assure you, me, that naming that fallacy has never once convinced them to change their minds. One of my friends once linked to an article that was chock full of, in my opinion, deliberate logical fallacies intended to persuade the reader. And I pointed that out to my friend, and their response was something like, and I paraphrase, but the conclusion is true. And here's the thing. I didn't agree with that conclusion. That's probably obvious. And I clearly wasn't going to be persuaded to believe that conclusion based on an argument that was full of fallacies. But pointing out the fallacies to my friend didn't persuade them to change their mind, because they didn't come to that conclusion due to that argument, to that article that they'd linked to. They liked that article because they already agreed with its conclusion. So we were right back where we started before, disagreeing on the conclusion. And if you disagree with the conclusion, you need to disprove the conclusion directly, not the argument the person used to get there. Why? Well, I've already said the answer. The person didn't logic themselves into that position. They hold that position for some other reason. And they're likely using an argument in what is called post hoc rationalization. We need to look at the underlying reasons why a person would want to hold that position. And that's where things get real tricky. If you think about opinions as the result of a desire to hold them, we get a very different set of approaches. And that's going to move us into part 4, which in my opinion is maybe the most important part. One reason a person might hold a position, any position, is simply because holding any position is better than holding no position at all. We've already talked about the fear of the unknown and the fear that arises from the abyss, the data void. Many current conspiracy theories held by the vaccine hostile and hesitant is because early on, these things filled the data void. Most of you listening today are deeply familiar with the scientific method. You're comfortable sitting with scientific uncertainty. You're familiar with the fact that scientific consensus changes as new information becomes available. The vast majority of the American public sees scientists changing their minds as the scientists always being wrong. The scientists are the source of the uncertainty that makes them uncomfortable. In the course of a brief encounter, you're not going to be able to teach anyone a full appreciation of the joys of the scientific dialectic, but you can acknowledge the simple facts that we know. We're say things like, we're learning a lot and rapidly about this virus. Scientists are doing a great job, but they're moving quickly in uncharted territory. Mistakes will occur. Not all hypotheses will pan out. Here's what we know today, and here's how we know it. Provide certainty where there is certainty. Be sure to convey areas where our lack of knowledge is profound and where facts as we understand them right now are subject to change. Don't get dogmatic about the unknown, and definitely don't get dogmatic about facts of which you have no direct knowledge. Which leads us to our second strategy. Do know, and I thought about putting this slide first in this section, but decided that providing comfort was really, that really deserved to be our first tactic. But do know that you don't have to respond to literally every person or every attack, right? The Bill Gates story above is just entirely devoid of facts. There is literally no rebuttal that will assure anybody that believes that. The comment on the bottom is a genuine and reasonable statement of discomfort for which there is a good, reassuring reply. Don't get dragged into the mess. Or if you do, understand that you're acting in some other capacity than as a health or public health expert. So this slide is about public health communications, but has lessons for individual use as well. So here's some things we know about communications departments. Professionals can create communications products faster and therefore cheaper than non-professionals asked to write something. Professional marketing copy will contain efficient and evocative word choices as measured by their supervisors and managers. Professional copy may have, excuse me, fewer grammatical errors from the perspective of so-called standard English, which means, fewer rewrites, fewer edits, less attention having to be paid to copy editing. Professional copy is created by the peers and coworkers of potential carriers of that message. That is to say that, public health communication specialists will write copy intended to be delivered by, a health education expert or an appointed official or something like that. And public health officials are paid to carry out public health education communications duties, so their cooperation is predictable and manageable, which makes it easier to put into development, budgetary, and evaluation plans. However, professional copy is often not trusted by individuals in the most vulnerable communities and has sometimes caused or aggravated the very disparities that it hopes to close. And that leads us here. You have to co-create messages with the priority population. And just to be clear, I'm not saying with the priority population in mind. I'm saying co-create the messages with them. I know that this, I know this has there's a potentially problematic angle here. It's one thing to encourage public health to partner with certain kinds of social outreach or advocacy groups. But in this case, we have identified conservatives as the priority population. And for obvious reasons, the idea of public health officials, i.e. those working in federal, state, and local governments, the idea of a PHO reaching out to co-create messages for individuals with a specific political ideology can be difficult. And I get that, but it's also not important. It's not impossible, but rather it is important. And finally, some things to keep in mind as we co-create messages with the person we hope to reassure and maybe persuade. The things on this slide are hard to do. They're much easier for the liars to do. The truth tellers, as I said before, are constrained by the facts, and the facts change slowly, and they're oftentimes boring. Say what you will, but it's just far more interesting to talk about SARS-2 being created in the lab and secretly distributed worldwide and suddenly activated by 5G cell towers so that Bill Gates can run the world. It's just a more exciting story than whatever happened, no matter what really happened. I do want to point out that when I say use humor, do try to avoid mockery at all costs. Mockery isn't funny to the person being mocked, and that's who needs to find the humor in whatever you do. In short, I think we need to listen to the vaccine hesitant. We need to understand that they're us. The fear and uncertainty they feel is the same fear and uncertainty that we have felt about other things and that we will feel again. The missteps in their logic are hardwired into our human brains, and we will make those mistakes in the future as we have made them in the past. Remember, the reason we want to take the vaccine is the reason we want them to take the vaccine is because we want to protect them. Rolling our eyes, mocking, getting frustrated with them, being angry with them, etc. These things are not evidence of how much we care. And me, I am talking to myself. Remember to slow down and really think about, really concentrate why we're engaging with the vaccine hesitant individuals to start with. If you're engaging to persuade someone to consider the vaccine, then mockery just won't be your tactic. And if you're engaging to feel superior to them, then maybe that's where you just ignore it. If you are willing and if you feel safe, then I do encourage knowledgeable professionals to engage across as many social platforms as you can. It doesn't matter if you're just providing a chart or a graph or your own personal experience in the hospital, or if you're just a genuinely engaging person with the potential to go viral. Get the good evidence-based stuff out there. You never know what's going to prove helpful. I follow quite a few COVID-related folks on TikTok, and I do think that's a good place for them to get their content in front of a lot of younger folks who are getting vaccinated at lower rates than needed. And so finally, it's going to move us into our brief review of some of the resources that I used to put this presentation together. So just on sort of this is the basics of lateral reading. You can start here. Teachthought.com is a really great website. The second link there is to just a short course on lateral reading, or if you don't have time for a full short course and you just want a longer description than the one I provided, you can check out that link to a short YouTube video. This PDF will be made available later on today, and these are all hyperlinks that you can just follow to the requisite recommendations here. More on just some basics. This is a great guide from the Pan American Health Organization and the World Health Organization, putting together just some very common terms that show up when we talk about epidemics and pandemics and the differences. And this is a good place for you to start, so that if this is not your language already, just to make sure that when you're speaking, you're using words in the most precise manner. And also when you're reading articles, you will notice that good science journalists and of course scientists, epidemiologists, they're all using these terms very correctly, and making sure that we understand the limits of each of these words in terms of what they allow us, what assumptions and logics they allow us, leaps and logic they allow us to make. It helps us refine our thinking a little bit to make sure that we are precisely where we need to be when we read a sentence that's maybe referring to some unfamiliar terminology. It also is good when you're reading the prevaricators stuff, because they will use lay people's misunderstanding of the precision of these words in ways to mislead their arguments, and they'll hide their directional shifts inside of these confusing words. So it's a really good reminder of what words might actually be target words for liars to plant the seeds of their doubt in. Okay, this is it's called the Debunking Handbook. It's 2020. This was put together specifically for debunking scientific disinformation as it relates to climate change, but there's a lot of similarities in just general scientific disinformation spreading with a purpose. And this guide can give you some really good hints and tricks as to what's going on and what actions you're able to take for both for yourself and as you're educating others. The left guide is I got it through First Draft, one of the partner institutions that put this guide together. It's the Vaccine Misinformation Management Field Guide. It's essentially, I don't want to say it's exactly like what you just saw in the debunking book, but it is very similar. It lets you know what kind of information is getting out there, and also then what you can do about it. It is available through the Public Health Collaborative website, which is also just a broadly more a good resource more broadly. If you are thinking of actually engaging online, I highly recommend the book on the left, also put together by First Draft. It was put together back in October 2019, so obviously it was not put together with COVID misinformation, disinformation campaigns in mind. But again, very basic general strategies for how the social web is used to make messages more and more viral, and then also how to protect yourself from becoming a victim of that virality, and also then how you can use similar tactics and techniques online with your own online engagement to get the good information to a broader audience. And on the right there is just a cute infographic that sort of puts everything down into a nice set of bullet points. Highly recommend Cranky Uncle. This again was put together to teach high schoolers, if I'm getting the story right in my head, to teach high schoolers how to engage with climate deniers. So again, with this is a lot of our understanding of how climate or how science disinformation works was because of witnessing and studying how those provocateurs were able to use the social web and YouTube videos and stuff like that to undermine climate scientists. this is really, if I sort of really glossed over logical fallacies. I do think that they are, knowing about them and being able to recognize them are valuable in reading things. Just if you really want to spend the time with it. And this is a good, fun way to spend some time with it if you want. And so in this app, you have a conversation with your cranky uncle, and you're being trained while you do that to identify what cranky uncle, how cranky uncle has been misled himself, and what he may be doing to mislead you. And then you then are able to try to construct arguments that may be more counter arguments that may be more persuasive. Okay, and then there's just some general websites. Some of these I already linked to good resources from them. I already mentioned the Public Health Communications Collaborative. I also mentioned the last link, First Draft. And in the middle, hashtag Science Up First and Skeptical Science are two fantastic resources that I encourage just sort of visiting these sites kind of regularly. Just to you can, when you do that, you sort of get a good sense of what are the most popular pieces of disinformation that are being spread around at any given moment, and then also if you need them, some actual direct counterpoints to those particular facts. If you see that they're being used in your clinic or in the public that you're talking to, then you might want to come up with some more precise talking points to counter the novel disinformation tidbits that keep arising. I did mention when we talked about racial and ethnic medical distrust that we do need specific community-led outreach into these groups. And so if you're looking for some good information on that, BCAC 19, the Black Coalition Against COVID-19, is a great resource. That's their front page listed there. Again, I'll be linking out to these. And Unidos US, US's website, Esperanza Hope for All, another good resource for reaching out directly to, obviously, in both of these cases, the Black and then Hispanic communities. And that is going to wrap it up for me. And I will be making this video available shortly. Thank you all very much for your time.